14 tons. That is what one orchard dumped on the back of a 28-year-old woman's inherited farm property in a single October week. 14 tons of bruised, split, and fermenting apples that the Holloway family orchard had been paying $46 a ton to dispose of through a commercial composting contractor, and that orchard manager Dale Holloway had offered to route to her property instead for nothing. Partly because it saved him the disposal fee, and partly because, as he told his operations manager afterward, he had seen the condition of the grandmother's old place and figured the apples weren't going to be the worst thing about the situation. By the spring of the third year after that October delivery, Nadia Voss's artisan apple cider vinegar operation was generating enough monthly revenue to be described as a five-figure annual business. Her raw, unpasteurized product was in 4 Los Angeles specialty grocery accounts and at 2 of the city's most followed farmers markets. And the specific story of her vinegar's origin, the bruised culls from a single orchard delivered to a grandmother's neglected Los Angeles farm by a man who had meant it as a convenience for himself rather than an opportunity for anyone else, had become the most distinctive provenance narrative in the city's crowded artisan food market, which was a market that ran on provenance narratives the way most markets ran on margin and price. Dale Holloway had not intended to give anyone a narrative. He had intended to reduce his disposal costs by rerouting waste to a property whose owner he had assessed as unlikely to do anything inconvenient with it. He was the same man who sat at a Los Angeles County agricultural development meeting in the spring of that third year, watching a specialty food distribution representative explain why small-batch artisan vinegar, with documented single-orchard apple provenance, was the fastest-growing category in the region's premium condiment market, and why a specific operation in the San Fernando Valley was currently supply-constrained against documented buyer demand, an explanation that Dale listened to with the expression of a man doing a specific calculation about a decision he had made for the wrong reasons. None of that had happened yet on the October afternoon when the first truck backed up to Nadia Voss's gate, and the driver asked her where she wanted the apples, and she looked at 14 tons of rotting fruit and said she needed a few minutes to think about it, which was the most honest answer she had given anyone in the 3 months since she had driven out to the San Fernando Valley to look at the property her grandmother had left her and had understood, standing in the overgrown yard of a neglected 2-acre farm that had once been a productive small holding and was now a maintenance liability she had neither the knowledge nor the money to immediately address, that she had inherited something significantly more complicated than a gift. To understand how 14 tons of rotten apples became a 5-figure artisan business that had Los Angeles specialty grocers on a waiting list, you have to start with what Nadia Voss did not know about farming or fermentation or the Los Angeles specialty food market when the first truck arrived, and with why not knowing those things turned out to be less limiting than the people who knew them assumed it would be. The San Fernando Valley farm that Nadia's grandmother, Rosa Voss, had worked for most of 4 decades was one of the last operating small holdings in a neighborhood that had spent the previous 20 years transitioning from the mixed residential agricultural character that had defined the valley's edge communities since the post-war era into the kind of denser residential and commercial development that the region's housing economics made increasingly inevitable. Rosa had kept the 2 acres in production through most of her active years, growing citrus, vegetables, and a small herb section that she sold at local farmers markets until her health had made the market trips impractical, and she had let the property's productive sections fall into varying degrees of neglect over the previous 5 years while maintaining the structures and the irrigation infrastructure well enough that the farm was still, when Nadia arrived to assess it, a recognizable small farm rather than simply an overgrown lot. Nadia had grown up in the city proper, 2 generations and a meaningful cultural distance from the farming practice her grandmother had maintained, and the inheritance had arrived during a period of her life that was already complicated by a recently ended relationship, a freelance graphic design career that was generating income she described to friends as uneven, and a set of practical agricultural skills that she assessed, honestly and without particular distress about the assessment, as approximately 0. Dale Holloway's orchard was the largest apple-growing operation within reasonable trucking distance of the property, 42 acres of established variety plantings in the foothills that supplied both commercial grocery accounts and a direct-to-consumer pick-your-own operation that had become a destination for the urban families who drove out from the city on fall weekends. Dale had been running the orchard since inheriting it from his own father 12 years earlier, and he sat on the county's Agricultural Development Advisory as the representative of the region's remaining commercial fruit operations, a position he held with the easy confidence of someone whose operation was productive enough to be taken seriously and established enough to be taken for granted. The cull apple disposal problem was a standard annual cost of running a commercial orchard, bruised and cosmetically imperfect fruit that was unsuitable for grocery sale or the pick-your-own operation, and that the composting contractor handled for a fee that Dale had been tracking as a line item he intended to reduce when a better option presented itself. Nadia's inherited farm had presented itself as a better option in the specific sense that routing the culls to her property cost him less than the contractor and required no ongoing obligation on his part once the delivery arrangement was agreed to. And the arrangement had been agreed to at a brief conversation at her farm gate, where Nadia had said yes before she had thought through what 14 tons of apples in October actually meant for a 2-acre property with no established processing infrastructure and an owner with no food production experience. B. Samuels had been operating a fermented foods production operation out of a commercial kitchen share in the Atwater Village neighborhood for 6 years, producing small-batch kimchi, kombucha, and fermented hot sauce under her own label and selling at the same farmers market circuit that Nadia had been thinking about as a potential outlet for whatever she eventually managed to produce from the farm. She was also the person who answered when Nadia, in something close to desperation after the second day of watching apples ferment in the October heat, posted to a local urban farming forum asking whether anyone had experience with large volumes of damaged apples and what to do with them besides compost. B drove over the following morning and spent an hour at the apple pile, the way she spent time at most things that interested her, which was slowly and with focused attention, before she told Nadia that what she had in front of her was the feedstock for a small-batch apple cider vinegar operation, and that the specific combination of heirloom and heritage variety culls she was looking at, which she had identified by examining the fruit, was better raw material for artisan ACV than most vinegar producers had access to because single variety or single orchard vinegar was a documented premium category, and almost nobody was making it in Los Angeles from documented local fruit. She said the word documented twice, and Nadia, who had spent her career in graphic design building brand narratives for clients, understood on the second use exactly what B was pointing at. The story of where the apples had come from, a named local orchard, a specific variety mix, a grandmother's farm, an October delivery of what the commercial food system considered waste, was not incidental to the product. It was the product, expressed in liquid form, and if the fermentation quality matched the provenance quality, the resulting vinegar would be positioned in exactly the premium tier of the Los Angeles artisan food market that was currently underserved by local production. Nadia asked B how she knew all of this. B said she had been trying to source single orchard apple cider vinegar for a recipe development client for the previous year and had been unable to find a local producer, which was why she had answered the forum post before she had finished reading it. She asked whether Nadia wanted to learn how to make vinegar. Nadia said she did. They started that afternoon. Dr. Priya Sundaram ran the Fermentation Science Extension program at the State University's Food Science Department and had been documenting artisan fermented food operations in the Southern California region for 8 years as part of a research program that was small enough to be flexible and well-connected enough to be useful when a small producer needed scientific validation of a product claim. She contacted Nadia in the second year of the operation after one of BEA's colleagues had mentioned the single orchard ACV project at a fermented foods industry event, and she drove out to the San Fernando Valley farm on a Tuesday morning with a sampling kit and the particular alert quality of a researcher who has heard a description that either proves out or doesn't and prefers to find out quickly. She spent a morning testing the fermentation vessels, measuring pH progression across batches from different fruit deliveries, and examining the mother culture that Nadia and B had maintained through the operation's first processing season. "You have something unusual here," she said, which was a sentence she used sparingly and that Nadia had learned, in the 2 years since B had appeared at the apple pile, to take seriously when someone with a credential said it. "The microbial diversity in your mother culture is significantly higher than what I see in most artisan ACV operations at this scale, and the pH progression data across your batch records is consistent and controlled in a way that suggests your fermentation management is better than a 2-year-old operation typically achieves, she asked about the apple sourcing consistency. And when Nadia showed her the delivery records she had been keeping from the orchard arrangements, Sundaram asked whether Dale Holloway had ever provided variety documentation for the cull deliveries. Nadia said he had not, that the deliveries had been informal arrangements without paperwork. Sundaram said that variety documentation would strengthen the single orchard provenance claim considerably because it would let the product make specific variety claims rather than general orchard claims, and that if Nadia could get Holloway to provide it retroactively from his growing records, the documentation package for the product would be substantially more valuable for wholesale account acquisition. Nadia said she would ask. She had not spoken directly to Dale Holloway since the initial gate conversation 2 Octobers earlier. Nadia did not approach Dale Holloway about the variety documentation immediately, and she did not mention Sundaram's visit to anyone at the County Agricultural Development Advisory. She spent the spring and summer of the second year building the production infrastructure and the market relationships that the first year had shown were viable, but that the operation's initial scale had not been large enough to sustain at the volume the market was asking for. The commercial kitchen share arrangement she and B had negotiated gave her access to processing space 3 days a week during the slow season and had been renegotiated to 5 days as the batch volume grew. And she had hired a part-time assistant in the summer whose previous experience was in restaurant kitchens rather than fermented food production, but whose palate and attention to process had turned out to be more useful than any specific fermentation credential. The 2 farmers market accounts she had entered in the first year had produced, by the end of the second season, a waiting list of specialty grocery buyers who had encountered the product at the market and wanted to talk about wholesale accounts, a development she had not been ready for at the end of the first year and was actively preparing for at the end of the second. B had moved from informal advisor to formal production partner by the spring, a structure they had put in writing before the first wholesale conversation with any external buyer, because B had learned in 6 years of artisan food production that informal partnerships in this industry had a predictable outcome when commercial interest arrived, and none of the outcomes were good. The Holloway variety documentation question had been sitting on Nadia's to-do list through most of the second year, not because she had forgotten it, but because approaching Dale felt like a conversation that required more standing than the first 2 years had given her, and she had decided to approach it when the wholesale account numbers gave her a clearer version of what she was actually asking him to support with his records. Dale Holloway became aware that something commercial was happening with the cull apple deliveries sometime in the second year, when a woman at his pick-your-own operation mentioned, without any particular agenda, that she had just bought a bottle of Voss Farm single orchard apple cider vinegar at the Studio City Farmers Market, and that it was the best ACV she had ever used, and that she hadn't realized it was made from Holloway apples. Dale had smiled and said he was glad to hear it and had not mentioned that he had no idea what Voss Farm single orchard apple cider vinegar was, or why it was being sold at a Studio City Farmers Market. He called his operations manager that afternoon and asked whether anyone had been in touch with the Voss property about the cull deliveries recently. The operations manager said the deliveries had been running on the informal schedule they had set up 2 years earlier, and that he had not had any contact with the property owner beyond the delivery coordination. Dale drove by the farm on his way back from a supply errand the following week and saw that the property looked considerably less neglected than it had when he had arranged the original cull delivery, which he had assumed at the time would be a one-season arrangement that would end when the new owner eventually sold the property or gave up on maintaining it. He pulled over and looked at the farm for several minutes before he drove on, and he mentioned to the advisory at the next meeting that a small-scale urban artisan operation appeared to be making commercial use of orchard culls in the San Fernando Valley, framing it as a regional food economy observation rather than anything connected to his own property's delivery arrangement. The advisory's chair made a note to invite a regional specialty food representative to a future session, which was the origin of the meeting where the specialty food distribution representative spoke about the artisan ACV category. The County Agricultural Development Advisory meeting in the spring of the third year was the first time the Voss Farm operation had been discussed in any official county context, and it was attended, in addition to the regular advisory membership, including Dale, by 2 specialty food distribution representatives the chair had invited and by Nadia herself, who had accepted the advisory's invitation to speak about the urban farm-to-artisan production model specifically because Sundaram had told her that the county context was the right venue for making the variety documentation request, and that arriving with a commercial track record made the request substantially more likely to succeed than arriving without one. She presented the operation's 3-year production and revenue history, the fermentation process documentation that Sundaram's program had helped her build, and the market demand data that showed supply as the binding constraint on growth rather than buyer interest. She then described the single orchard provenance story and the role that Holloway Family Orchards cull apples played in it, and she asked, specifically and on the record, whether the orchard would be willing to provide variety documentation for its cull apple varieties going forward, which would allow the product to make specific variety claims that the wholesale market was prepared to pay a premium for. Dale Holloway was in the room. He had not known, when he agreed to attend the meeting, that the artisan ACV operation the chair had mentioned as a discussion topic was the Voss Farm operation, or that the cull delivery arrangement he had set up as a disposal cost reduction was its origin story, and the specific experience of having that sequence explained in a county meeting room in front of a dozen people was one he described afterward to his operations manager as educational in a way he had not expected to need in education. He said yes to the variety documentation request on the record, and the advisory recorded the agreement in the meeting notes before the session adjourned. The wholesale accounts that the variety documentation made possible opened in the following season, and the 5-figure annual revenue that the operation had reached in its 3rd year grew in its 4th and 5th under a production expansion that Nadia and B had funded through a combination of a small business development loan and a revenue-sharing arrangement with Sundaram's program that gave the university's fermentation research unit access to ongoing product data in exchange for the validation documentation that the wholesale accounts required. The Los Angeles Specialty Food Press covered the operation in the 4th year in a feature that described the provenance narrative the way Nadia had always understood it needed to be described, which was as a story about the specific distance between what the commercial food system called waste and what a producer with the right knowledge and attention called raw material. A distance that in the Voss Farm case had been measured in 1 gate conversation and 14 tons of October apples. Dale Holloway was quoted in the feature, briefly, confirming the orchard's role in the Vinegar's origin and describing the relationship as a regional food economy partnership, which was accurate in the sense that it had become one and that the variety documentation agreement had formalized it into something that resembled one, and which was also, as B pointed out to Nadia after reading the feature, a description of something that had started as a disposal cost reduction and had been retroactively upgraded by the passage of 3 years and a county meeting record. Nadia said she thought that was probably fine, and that the most important thing the feature had described correctly was that the grandmother's farm was the production site, which it was, and that the grandmother had maintained the irrigation infrastructure, which she had, and that without both of those facts the 14 tons of October apples would have been composted by the contractor, and the story would have been Dale's disposal cost reduction and nothing more. The lesson Los Angeles eventually took from the Voss Farm operation was not a lesson that the city's commercial food economy was eager to articulate directly, because the most direct version of it was that the boundary between what the commercial food system classified as waste and what a skilled producer could make from the same material was determined almost entirely by who was standing next to the material when it arrived and what they knew about what to do with it. Dale Holloway had known 14 tons of bruised apples as a disposal problem because that was the category his commercial apple operation had available for fruit that couldn't be sold whole, and the disposal category was the right category for the operation he was running and the relationships he had access to. Nadia Voss had known the same 14 tons as raw material because B. Samuels had told her what it was, and B had known what it was because she had spent 6 years in artisan fermented food production understanding the specific gap between what the commercial food system treated as waste and what a premium specialty market would pay significant prices for. And that gap in Los Angeles was wide enough and deep enough and consistent enough across product categories that an entire small-scale artisan food economy had been built inside it, mostly by people who were not from commercial farming backgrounds and who therefore had no inherited assumption that the disposal category was the right category for the material. Nadia Voss was one of those people. She had inherited a farm she did not know how to run, and because she did not know how to run it, she had said yes to 14 tons of rotten apples at a gate conversation that anyone with a conventional farming background would have recognized as a disposal offer and declined. And because she had said yes without knowing what she was saying yes to, she had been available to learn from someone who did know, which was the sequence that made everything else possible. Drive past the Voss farm on its San Fernando Valley Road today, and the 2 acres look considerably more productive than they did in the October of the first apple delivery, the processing shed that Nadia built in the second year visible from the street. The grandmother's irrigation infrastructure running again in the orchard section that Nadia had replanted in the third year with rootstock that Sundaram's program had recommended for the site's specific soil conditions. The grandmother's name is on the label, in a font that Nadia designed herself, below the farm name and above the production notes that describe the Holloway Cull apple varieties by name, because the variety documentation eventually produced a label that said something true about where the product came from in a way that the original gate conversation had not, and saying true things about where a product comes from turned out to be. In the Los Angeles specialty food market of the late 1990s and early 2000s, worth considerably more per bottle than Dale Holloway had calculated when he pulled up to the gate with a disposal offer and a reduced trucking cost in mind. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find it. Share it with someone who has ever been handed something the system called waste and made something from it that the system had no category for. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one every week. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you found the right use for something everyone else had already given up on. We read every single one.